She walked through the door of the only church in Coldwater Ridge, soaking wet, shaking, and 9 days past the moment her entire life had collapsed, and every single person inside turned their back on her at once. Not one face softened. Not one hand reached out. Eliza Cross stood in the doorway of that church with rain running down her neck and mud caked to the hem of her dress, and she understood with a clarity that cut all the way to bone that she had already ceased to exist to these people. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been the one they turned away from, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The night Eliza Cross appeared at Rowan Hale's door, the wind off the Beartooth Range was mean enough to strip bark from a pine. She didn't knock so much as fall against it, one fist hitting the wood 3 times before her legs gave out, and she caught herself on the doorframe breathing hard, her knuckles scraped raw from where she'd grabbed at the split rail fence in the dark. She hadn't seen the fence. She hadn't seen much of anything for the last hour. The lantern she'd carried out of Coldwater Ridge had burned out somewhere past the Second Creek crossing, and after that it had just been wind and blackness, and the sound of her own boots on frozen ground. When the door opened, she wasn't ready for the light. She threw one arm up across her face and flinched back hard, and the man standing in the doorframe, tall, dark-coated, a rifle already leveled at chest height, said nothing for a full 3 seconds. He just looked at her. She could feel him doing it even with her arm blocking her eyes. She could feel the assessment, the calculation. She'd been on the receiving end of that kind of look for 9 days running, and she'd learned to brace for what came after it. "I ain't got money," she said first, because that was always the first thing people assumed. "And I ain't dangerous. I'm just—" Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated it, hated herself for it, but there was nothing left in her to perform steadiness. "I'm just cold." The rifle lowered. "How'd you find this place?" the man said. "Followed the fence line. Your post lantern's still lit at the south corner." A pause. "That lantern's been dark for 2 weeks. Then I followed something else. I don't know." She finally dropped her arm and looked at him directly. He was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his early 30s, she thought, though the set of his jaw added years to him, the kind of years that come from something other than time. He had dark eyes and a face that seemed to have made a permanent peace with hardness. He didn't look cruel. He didn't look kind either. He looked like a man who had learned a long time ago that both of those things cost something. "Please," she said. "I'm not asking for much. Just to be out of the wind for an hour." He stepped back from the door. She walked in. The inside of the house was nothing like Coldwater Ridge had been. Nothing like the boarding house she'd lived in for the last 3 years. Nothing like anything she'd had since before her father died. It was just a single long room with a fire going in a stone hearth, a plank table with 2 chairs, and a shelf of provisions along the east wall. Clean, though. She noticed that immediately. Hard used, but clean. There were no decorative things except a small framed piece of paper above the mantel that she couldn't read from across the room. "Sit," the man said. He set the rifle against the wall and moved to the fire without looking at her again. She sat. She didn't mean to say anything more. She'd planned walking through the dark to ask for an hour of warmth and then move on toward the next town, Callaway, if she had her distances right, maybe 14 miles south. She had a cousin in Callaway, a cousin who might not yet have heard what they were saying about her in Coldwater Ridge. She'd planned to be quiet and grateful and gone before she became a problem. But then he handed her a tin cup of something hot, not coffee, just hot water, with something bitter steeped in it, and the warmth of the cup against her palms after hours of cold did something to her that she hadn't expected. It unlocked something behind her sternum that had been locked up tight for 9 days, and before she could stop it, her eyes filled. She didn't cry. She refused to cry. But he saw it because he was watching her now with that same measured look, and he said very quietly, "You running from something, or you just got nowhere left to go?" "Second one," she said. "What happened?" She looked at the fire instead of at him. "You haven't heard. I don't go into town much. Coldwater Ridge." She said it like a place name alone could explain the whole of it. He was quiet a moment. "I know of it, don't know its business." So she told him. Not all of it. Not the parts that still felt like open wounds she couldn't stand to press on, but enough. She told him about Daniel Marsh, who had courted her for 8 months and let her believe it was leading somewhere real. She told him about the letters she'd written. Private letters. Letters a woman writes when she trusts someone completely. And how Daniel had shown those letters to 3 men at the saloon one night in January, read them aloud while men laughed. She told him how the Reverend's wife had stopped speaking to her the next morning. How Mrs. Callahan at the boarding house had given her 2 days to collect her things. How even the women she'd thought were her friends had crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. She didn't tell him how she'd gone to Daniel first. How she'd stood in front of him in the cold outside the feed store and asked him like a fool why. And how he'd looked at her with something almost like boredom and said she'd taken the whole thing too seriously. That she should have known better than to put things like that in writing if she didn't want them read. That part she kept. So they just, the man said slowly, put you out. In so many words. And your family. My father's been dead 4 years, my mother before that. I have a cousin in Callaway, but she... Eliza stopped. She may have heard by now. Word travels. The man sat down in the second chair across the fire from her. He'd poured himself nothing. He just sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor between them, and she could see him thinking something through. She braced herself. She'd gotten very good at bracing. My name's Rowan Hale, he said. This is my ranch. I run cattle, some horses. I got a hand who comes in 3 days a week, but he sleeps in town. He looked up at her then. I ain't offering charity. I don't have the resources for it, and I wouldn't insult you with it anyway. But I'm short a pair of hands, and winter's bad this year, and if you're willing to work, you can have the back room and a share of whatever food there is until the weather breaks and you figure your next step. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. You don't know me. No. You don't know if what I told you is true. No. Then why? Because you followed a fence line in the dark for God knows how long, and you asked for an hour out of the wind, he said. That ain't the behavior of someone looking to cause trouble. That's the behavior of someone who's run out of road. He held her gaze steadily. And because I know what Coldwater Ridge is, I know what that town does to people, it decides it's done with. Something in her chest pulled tight. How do you know that? He didn't answer. He just stood and took her cup and refilled it from the kettle without asking whether she wanted more. She stayed. The first week was the kind of awkward that comes from two people who have both learned through separate and painful processes not to trust easily. They worked around each other more than with each other. Eliza taking over the cooking on the second day, because the alternative was another meal of burned salt pork. Rowan shoveling out the stock pen while she did it, neither of them saying much beyond what the work required. He wasn't cold exactly. He wasn't warm either. He was careful. She recognized the carefulness because she was doing the same thing herself. What she hadn't told him the first night was that she had skills beyond cooking and keeping a house. What she hadn't told him was that for the 3 years before Daniel Marsh and the letters and the destruction of everything she had worked as a bookkeeper for Alderman Cross, no relation who ran the largest dry goods operation in Coldwater Ridge. She had kept his accounts managed, his receivables tracked every dollar that moved through that store, and she had been good at it. Better than good. She had found in her second year a discrepancy in the accounts that had saved Alderman Cross $400, and exposed a supplier who'd been shorting shipments for 18 months. She hadn't told Rowan any of that because she didn't know yet what it was worth to him, and she had learned recently and painfully that offering your value to someone before you understood their character was how you ended up vulnerable. But on the 5th day, she found the ledger. It was sitting on the shelf behind the provisions between a tin of salt and a coil of rope, and she would have left it alone entirely, except that it was open to a page covered in numbers that didn't add up, and Eliza Cross had never in her life been able to walk past numbers that didn't add up. She stood there with a crock of dried beans in one hand and looked at the open ledger for almost a full minute before she closed it carefully and put it back exactly where it had been. She thought about it all through supper. She thought about it while she washed the tin plates. She thought about it while she listened to Rowan outside talking to his horses in the low, even voice he used with them that was different from any voice she'd heard him use with people. Finally, when he came inside and sat down and took his boots off, she said, "Your ledger's wrong." He looked up. "What?" "The one on the shelf. I wasn't prying, it was open. But the numbers on that page don't reconcile. You've got a credit recorded twice in the same week, and a payment listed on a date that falls before the invoice." He stared at her. "How do you know that he—" "Because I kept books for 3 years." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm telling you because it matters. If your accounts are off, your tax filing will be off. And if your tax filing is off in this territory right now, you could be looking at a lien. Or worse." Rowan was very still. "Or worse how?" "Garrett," she said. She'd heard the name twice since she arrived once from Rowan's hired hand, a quiet man named Pete, who'd mentioned it in passing, and once from Rowan himself, in a conversation he clearly hadn't known she was close enough to overhear. She'd gathered enough to know that Garrett owned the large spread to the north, and had been pressing at the edges of Rowan's land for 2 years. She'd gathered enough to know that the pressure wasn't casual. Rowan's jaw tightened. "What do you know about Garrett?" "Nothing specific, but I know the pattern." She looked at him directly. "When a man like that wants someone's land and can't take it by force, outright he finds another way. He finds the paperwork. He finds the debt. He finds the filing error, and he brings it to the county office with a man from the bank beside him. And by the time the rightful owner realizes what's happened, the transfer's already been recorded." The fire popped. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the house. "I'd like to look at your full accounts," she said. "If you'll let me." Rowan looked at her for a long time. Then he got up, went to the shelf, and brought the ledger back to the table. He set it in front of her without a word. Then he went and got the box of loose receipts and billing records from beneath the shelf and set those beside it. "Take whatever time you need," he said. She pulled the lantern closer and opened to the first page. What she found over the next 2 evenings was worse than a simple recording error, and it was also not accidental. She went through 3 years of Rowan's accounts with the systematic patience that Alderman Cross had paid her well to apply, and what emerged from the columns and the receipts and the dated entries was a picture that made her go very cold and very quiet. Someone had been in these records before her. Not Rowan. She'd spent enough time now watching how Rowan Hale moved through the world, how he handled things to know his handwriting and his patterns. The alterations weren't his. They were subtle. The kind of subtle that required knowledge of how territorial land records worked, how tax assessments were calculated, how a discrepancy could be made to look like an owner's negligence rather than interference. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. And what they were doing was constructing a paper case for Rowan Hale's default. On the third morning, she set the ledger on the table in front of Rowan at breakfast and pointed to 4 specific entries. "These didn't come from your receipts," she said. "I've matched everything you have against what's recorded, and these 4 don't exist in your actual transactions. They were added. And together, they create a debt figure that—" She turned to the last page she'd marked. "That would, when assessed against your current land valuation, qualify your property for forced sale under the territorial debt provision." Rowan sat very still. "Garrett's done this before," she said. "I don't know that for certain yet. But this is too clean to be the first time." She looked up at him. "Who else has had access to these records?" "Just me. And—" He stopped. "Who?" "About a year ago. The county assessor came out. Standard visit, he said. I let him look at the books because I had nothing to hide." His voice had gone flat and hard in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "He was in here alone for about an hour while I showed his deputy around the property." "Was the deputy from this county?" Rowan went very still. "No. He said he was new. Transferred from—" He stopped again. "From where Garrett has connections," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when someone has just watched a thing they suspected be confirmed in front of their eyes. Rowan's hands were flat on the table. She could see the muscle working in his jaw. She didn't rush him. She just waited because she understood that a man who'd spent years building something out of nothing needed a moment when he found out someone had been quietly taking it apart. "Can you fix it?" he said finally. "I can document it," she said. "I can produce a counter-record, every receipt, every legitimate entry cross-referenced against dates and amounts with the discrepancies clearly marked and annotated. If we take that to the county land office with a formal challenge, it forces them to open an inquiry rather than a simple default proceeding." She paused. "It won't be fast, and Garrett will know we're coming once we file. He'll have time to prepare." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3 if your records go back further than what's in this box." "There's another box," he said, "under the floorboards in the back room." She almost smiled. "Of course there is." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her in a way he hadn't quite done before, a way that had less calculation in it, and something else she didn't have a word for yet. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "Because you gave me a door to walk through when every other door in 50 miles was closed," she said simply. "And because whoever did this to your accounts is the same kind of man who did what was done to me in Coldwater Ridge. I have a particular feeling about that kind of man." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once the way men out here nodded when they'd decided something and had no more use for words about it. "Then let's get to work," he said. They worked. That was the truth of those first weeks, the plain and unglamorous truth of it. They worked. Eliza rebuilt Rowan's accounts from the ground up, entry by entry, cross-referencing receipts against ledger dates, annotating every discrepancy in her clean, precise hand, constructing an argument in numbers that was airtight and documented and devastating to anyone who tried to contest it. Rowan did the ranch work and brought her coffee she didn't ask for, and occasionally stood at her shoulder and looked at what she was building with an expression she was starting to recognize as something close to wonder. Pete, the hired hand, came and went and said very little to her directly, but she caught him watching her one afternoon over the top of his hat with an expression that was less suspicious than it had been in the first week, which she counted as progress. It was on a Tuesday, the 15th day, that Daniel Marsh rode onto the property. She heard the horse before she heard the voice, and something in the quality of that hoofbeat, something uneven, reckless, made her put down her pen before he'd even called out. She went to the window. He was already half off the horse, catching himself against the saddle, and she could see from 30 feet away that he'd been drinking hard and recently. "Eliza." He said her name like it was an accusation. "I know you're in there." She stayed at the window. She didn't move toward the door. Rowan came around the side of the house from the direction of the stock pen, moving at a measured pace that looked calm, and was not. She could tell. She'd spent 15 days learning how Rowan Hale moved when he was calm versus when he was something else, and this was something else. "This is private property," Rowan said. His voice was even. "You're not welcome on it." Daniel swayed slightly and pointed past him at the window. "She's mine to deal with. That ain't your business, friend." "She ain't yours to deal with," Rowan said. "And I ain't your friend." "You don't know what she is." Daniel's voice had gone ugly in the particular way that liquor made it loose and self-righteous, and looking for an audience it didn't have. "You don't know what kind of woman you've let into your house." "I know exactly what kind of woman she is," Rowan said. He took one step forward, and his voice dropped, not louder, but more concentrated, the way pressure concentrates when you narrow a pipe. "The kind who minds her work and doesn't bother anyone who hasn't earned it. Now get back on that horse." Daniel stared at him. He was working himself toward something. She could see it, the way his hands moved at his sides, the way his chin lifted. She'd seen it before in the feed store, the moment before he'd said the things he'd said to her. She'd stood very still then. She'd been too surprised to do anything else. She was not surprised now. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her, and something crossed his face that she might have once thought was shame, but that she recognized now for what it was, the anger of a man who'd been caught doing a thing he knew was wrong and had decided it was someone else's fault. "You ought to be gone," he said. "You ought to be in Callaway or somewhere else where no one knows you. You've got no business staying on." "I'm working," she said. I'm earning my keep and minding my accounts, and I'm not leaving until I choose to." She kept her voice level. "And you're going to get on your horse and go back to whatever corner of Coldwater Ridge you crawled out of, Daniel, because you don't have any standing here. You don't have standing anywhere near me anymore." He took a step toward the porch. Rowan moved between them without hurry and without drama. Just stepped into the space, and something in the way he stood there, the complete absence of performance in it, the simple physical fact of him, stopped Daniel cold. They looked at each other. Then Daniel looked past Rowan to Eliza one more time, and whatever he saw in her face, because she was not looking away, she was done looking away, seemed to deflate him in some fundamental way. He made a sound she didn't have a word for. He turned and got back on his horse and rode off the way he'd come, and the sound of the hooves faded back toward the road. And then there was just the wind and the cold and the two of them standing in it. Rowan turned around. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She was surprised to find that it was true. "Yes, I am." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment with that look she still didn't have a word for. Then he said, "Cold out here. You should get back to those accounts." She went back inside. She sat back down in front of the ledger and picked up her pen, and she looked at the columns of numbers she'd been building, the careful, irrefutable record of what was real versus what had been fabricated. And she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with Rowan Hale, and everything to do with herself. A recognition. A remembering. She had been good at this. She was still good at this. No one had taken that from her. Not Daniel Marsh with his cruelty. Not Coldwater Ridge with its closed doors. Not the freezing walk through the dark to a stranger's fence line. She was still exactly who she had always been. She wrote the next entry in her clean, deliberate hand, and the lantern burned steady. And somewhere outside, Rowan Hale went back to his horses, and the work continued. The counter record was finished on a Thursday evening, 22 days after Eliza Cross had first fallen against Rowan Hale's door. She set the last page down on the table and pressed her palms flat against the wood and just breathed for a moment. 47 pages. Every legitimate transaction documented, every fabricated entry flagged and annotated, every date and amount cross-referenced against the original receipts that Rowan had kept in that second box under the floorboards, receipts that the county assessor would have had no way of knowing existed, which was, she suspected, precisely why the falsifications had been attempted in the first place. Whoever had done this had been thorough. They simply hadn't been thorough enough. Rowan was at the table across from her. He'd been sitting there for the last hour, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just present in the way he sometimes was, when she was working on something that mattered, as though his being in the room was its own form of contribution. She'd stopped finding it strange after the first week. Now she found it, if she was honest with herself, something close to steadying. "It's done," she said. He leaned forward and looked at the stack of pages without touching them. "All of it. Every entry from the last 3 years. I cross-referenced everything twice." She turned to the page she'd marked at the beginning. "The 4 fabricated entries are here, 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 and here. Each one is annotated with the corresponding legitimate record that proves it's false. When you take this to the county land office, you ask specifically for the territorial dispute filing, not the standard grievance form. The dispute filing triggers a mandatory review period, which means they can't process any default action against the property while the inquiry is open." Rowan looked at the marked page and then at her. "How do you know about the dispute filing?" "Because Alderman Cross used one against a supplier 4 years ago. I filed the paperwork myself." She paused. "You'll also want to bring Pete as a witness to your presence on the property during the period of the assessor's visit. His testimony that you were outside with the deputy while the assessor was alone in the house establishes opportunity." "Pete will come," Rowan said without any doubt in his voice. "He's been with me 6 years. He'll come." She nodded and started to straighten the pages into their final order, and Rowan reached out and put one hand over hers to stop her. Not grabbing, just stopping. She looked up. "Eliza," he said, "what you've done here." He stopped. He was not a man who found speeches easy, she'd learned that well enough. He tried again. I don't have the words for what this was. You gave me a roof, she said quietly. This is the least of what I owe you. That ain't... He pulled his hand back and looked at the table. That ain't how I meant it. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for the first time in days, which in February in Montana felt almost like a warning. I know, she said. And she did know. But there were things she wasn't ready to look at directly. Yet things that had begun to take shape in the space between working alongside someone and trusting them, and something else that didn't have a name, she was willing to give it. So she picked up the pages and evened them against the table and said, We should go to the land office first thing Monday. The earlier in the week, the less chance Garrett has of getting wind of it before the filing is registered. Rowan sat back. He accepted the redirect with the same quiet acceptance he applied to most things. Monday, he said. First thing. Pete's reaction when Rowan told him the next morning was not what Eliza expected. She'd anticipated skepticism, the kind of reserved sideways doubt that a man might have about a woman he'd known less than a month producing 47 pages of legal documentation from a set of mismanaged ranch accounts. What she got instead was Pete Delaney, looking at the annotated ledger for about 4 minutes in silence, then looking at her with something that was entirely straightforwardly respect. You found all this in 3 weeks, he said. It wasn't a question. The records were there, she said. Someone just needed to read them correctly. Pete set the ledger down. I'll be at the wagon at first light Monday, he said to Rowan. Then he looked at Eliza one more time, nodded once in that economy of gesture way that men out here communicated volumes and went back to work. The weekend passed with the particular tension of waiting, not the anxious kind, but the coiled, deliberate kind that comes when you've done everything you can do, and the next move belongs to the world. Eliza cleaned the kitchen and mended 2 shirts that had been in the mending pile since before she arrived, and Rowan rode the fence line on Saturday and came back in the late afternoon looking thoughtful in a way that meant something had shifted, but he hadn't decided whether to say it yet. She let him sit with it. She was getting good at knowing when to let Rowan Hale sit with things. Sunday evening, he said from across the room while she was reading, Garrett's going to push back hard. She looked up. I know. It won't just be through the land office. He's got men. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you said weather out here, not as something you could stop, only something you prepared for. When he finds out we've filed a dispute, he'll look for other pressure points. He'll look for ones he thinks you're too proud to defend, she said. The cattle, the water access on the East Range. He'll try something physical before he tries anything legal, because legal is slower, and he knows now that you're not letting this go without a fight. Rowan looked at her steadily. That's a very specific guess. It's not a guess, it's the pattern. She set the book down. I've watched men like Garrett in business, Rowan. They're the same, whether they're defrauding a dry goods supplier or stealing a cattle ranch. When the quiet method stops working, they go loud. They go loud fast because loud is designed to scare you into settling before the legal process has time to work. I don't scare easy. I know that. She held his gaze. But it's going to get harder before Monday's filing changes anything. You need to know that. I know it, he said. He stopped. He rubbed one hand across the back of his neck and looked at the fire. I don't want any of the hard that's coming to land on you. Something in her chest pulled. I'm not a guest here, she said carefully. I stopped being a guest about 3 weeks ago. He looked back at her. What are you then? She thought about that for a moment. Really thought about it because it deserved honesty. I'm someone who has a stake in this, she said finally. That's what I am. He nodded slowly, and whatever he was turning over in his mind he kept to himself. But something in the set of his shoulders changed slightly. Loosened. She'd noticed he did that held tension in his shoulders the way some men held it in their jaw, and she'd started to read it the way she read his ledger entries as information. They filed on Monday. The county land office was a single room in Callaway's municipal building, staffed by a clerk named Aldridge, who wore sleeve garters, and had the eyes of a man who processed paperwork for a living, and was deeply unexcited about all of it, until Eliza set 47 pages of annotated documentation on his desk and asked for the territorial dispute filing form. Aldridge looked at the stack. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Rowan. He picked up the top page of the documentation and read it for about 30 seconds. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "did you prepare this yourself?" "I did," she said. "What's your training?" 3 years as a bookkeeper for Alderman Cross in Coldwater Ridge. Before that, 2 years managing accounts for my father's freight operation. She kept her voice even and her hands still on the counter. The annotations reference specific territorial code sections. If you have questions about any of the discrepancies, I'm happy to walk you through the cross-references. Aldridge set the page down and looked at her for another moment. Then he turned to his cabinet and pulled out the dispute filing form. It took 2 hours. Aldridge read every annotated page, asked 12 questions, received 12 answers, and at the end of it stamped the filing registered and handed Rowan the copy with the date and seal on it. His expression by that point had gone from indifferent to something that was almost reluctant admiration. "You'll receive notice of the inquiry panel within 30 days, he said. "In the meantime, no default action can be processed on this property. That's statutory." He looked at Eliza one last time. "Whoever falsified those entries was sophisticated, ma'am. This was not easy to catch." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." They were back at the wagon before Rowan said anything. Pete was untying the horses and studiously looking somewhere else, giving them the space he'd evidently decided they needed. 30 days, Rowan said, at minimum. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "Garrett will know within the week. His man at the land office, and he will have a man there, will tell him. So we've got maybe a week of quiet before he moves." "Yes." Rowan looked down the length of Callaway's main street, a shorter, quieter version of Coldwater Ridge, with a hardware store, and a feed merchant, and a church at the far end, that was smaller than the one where Eliza had stood in the rain 4 weeks ago. He had a look on his face she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was calculating odds and didn't love the numbers. "Then we use the week," he said. They used the week. Rowan moved the cattle from the east pasture, the most vulnerable range, to the closer field where they could be watched from the house. He repaired the south fence line that had been in want of work since autumn. Pete started sleeping at the ranch 3 nights a week instead of going into town, his bedroll laid out in the barn with quiet, uncomplaining practicality. Eliza made a second copy of the full documentation and wrapped it in oilcloth and put it in the box under the floorboards where the old receipts had been. Because if anything happened to the copy at the land office, there needed to be another one somewhere Garrett's people wouldn't think to look. On the 5th day after the filing, a man came to the property line. He didn't come onto the property. He stayed on the road side of the fence, which was deliberate, the kind of deliberate that communicated a precise understanding of legal boundaries. He was on horseback, well-dressed, in the way that meant money rather than work. And he sat at the fence for about 10 minutes in the late afternoon while Rowan stood on the porch and looked back at him. Eliza watched from the window. Then the man on the horse tipped his hat once formally and rode back the way he'd come. Rowan came inside. "That was Garrett's foreman," he said. "Name of Cutter. I've seen him before." "He was looking at the cattle pasture," she said. "And the barn." "I know. He was counting what you have left and where it is." She turned from the window. "Rowan, whatever they're planning, they'll move before the inquiry panel convenes. That's the point. Force a crisis big enough that the filing becomes irrelevant because you've lost too much to rebuild, even if you win legally." Rowan sat down on the edge of the chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. It was late afternoon, and the light was going gray, and the fire needed another log, and neither of them moved to add one. "If they go for the cattle," he said, "I need to be out there, not in here." "I know." "That means you'd be in here," she said. "I know that too." He looked at her with something that was past calculation, now past the measured assessment she'd first seen in the doorway 4 weeks ago. It was something more open than that, and it cost him something to show it she could tell. "I don't like that," he said. "You don't have to like it," she said quietly. "You just have to trust that I can manage it." Something moved through his expression. "I do trust that," he said. "That's exactly what I don't like about it." She understood what he meant. She understood it completely. And because she did, she didn't push. She just said, "Then we make sure Pete's in the barn, and you're on the North Range, and I know where you both are, and we plan for what's coming rather than hoping it won't." He nodded. He got up and added a log to the fire. They started planning. The thing about waiting for something you know is coming is that it doesn't get easier with preparation. It just gets more specific. The dread doesn't diminish. It sharpens. Eliza had been keeping herself moving through the days on the discipline she'd built over 3 years of managing accounts under pressure, the ability to set aside what frightened her and focus on what was in front of her, on what could be controlled and documented and addressed. It was the same discipline that had gotten her to Rowan's fence line in the dark. It was the discipline of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury and work was the only thing that kept the world from closing in. But at night in the back room that had become hers without anyone officially designating it, so she let herself feel the weight of it. The fear that wasn't for herself, she'd already lost most of what there was to lose in Coldwater Ridge, and the losing of it had not killed her. The fear was for Rowan. For what he'd built out here year by slow year, in the kind of solitude that shaped a person into something harder and quieter and more real than any town life ever produced. He'd built this from nothing, and someone was trying to take it for money and power, and the simple arrogance of men who believed that what they wanted was reason enough to take it. She was not going to let that happen. She lay in the dark on the 10th night after the filing and listened to the wind come back up outside and made herself a promise in the particular way that she'd learned you had to make promises to yourself out here, not with words exactly, but with the settled certainty of someone who has decided. Not hoped. Decided. She had the accounts. She had the documentation. She had 47 pages of irrefutable truth that she'd built line by line out of what someone had tried to use to destroy a man who had done nothing except work hard and keep to himself and make the mistake of being in the way of someone who wanted his land. Whatever Garrett sent at them, she would be ready. The wind hammered the walls of the house. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and settled. And in the main room she heard Rowan's chair creak as he shifted in his own sleepless night, and the sound of it, that small human sound of someone else awake in the dark with you, was enough to let her finally close her eyes. They came on the 11th night. Eliza knew it before she heard anything. She woke from a thin, restless sleep with her heart already moving fast, the way the body sometimes knows what the mind hasn't caught up to yet. And she lay still for 3 seconds in the dark of the back room, listening to the quality of the silence. It was the wrong kind of silence. Too complete. The horses weren't moving in the barn. When horses went that still, it wasn't peace, it was fear. She was up and dressed before the first smell of smoke reached her. It came under the door first. Not heavy, not the rolling black smoke of something fully caught, but the thin, acrid edge of something just beginning. And that was somehow worse. Beginning meant there was still time. Beginning meant someone had planned this carefully enough to start it slow. She grabbed the oilcloth packet from under the floorboards before she did anything else. 47 pages. She tucked it inside her coat against her body and buttoned it closed over it, and then she went to the main room and to the window and looked out. The barn was on fire. Not the whole barn. The east corner, the side farthest from the house where the hay was stored. The flames were still low, but they were moving, and the wind that had come up 2 hours ago was going to carry them fast, and she could already hear the horses inside, no longer still now, loud and desperate in the way that horses in danger of burning are loud. She went for the door. She had it half open before a hand caught her arm from outside, and she came within one heartbeat of screaming before she realized it was Pete. "Don't go in there yet," he said low and hard. "There are men in the yard." She looked past him. In the dark beyond the firelight, she could make out 2 shapes, horses riderless, standing at the north fence, where no horses should have been. "How many?" she said. I saw 3 go around the back. Could be more. Pete was already moving her sideways along the front of the house out of the line of sight from the yard. Rowan went out 20 minutes ago. He heard something on the North Range. They split him off, she said immediately. They pulled him north and then they came here. Pete's jaw tightened. That's what I figure. The cattle. Some of them are already gone. I heard the herd moving before I smelled the smoke. She thought fast. The barn. The horses still inside. The documentation against her ribs. Rowan somewhere on the North Range in the dark, with men between him and the property. She thought about all of it at once, the way she'd learned to think about a ledger, not line by line, but as a whole picture where everything connected to everything else. If the barn goes, she said, it takes the feed stores. No feed stores, no keeping the cattle through the rest of winter, even if we get them back. I know. Can you get the horses out if I draw the men in the yard? Pete looked at her sharply. That ain't... Can you get them out? He held her gaze for a moment. East gate's clear from what I can see. If someone opened the main doors from the inside, I could push them through. Then I'll go in through the side door. Miss Cross. Pete. She kept her voice level. How long do we have before that corner is fully caught? He looked at the barn. The glow along the east wall had intensified in just the last 2 minutes. 10 minutes, maybe less. Then we don't have time for this conversation. She looked at him directly. I need you at the east gate. I'm going in through the side, on my count of 30. He stared at her for a second longer. Then he said with a short exhale that was not quite a curse, 30 seconds. Go. She went. The side door of the barn was on the west wall, away from the fire, and she moved along the front of the house and across the open ground between the house and barn at a low, fast run, knowing that crossing the open ground was the most dangerous part, knowing there were men somewhere in the dark yard who might see her, and knowing also that if she thought about that for more than a second she wouldn't move at all. She didn't think about it. She moved. She hit the side door and hauled it open, and the heat that came out of the barn was not yet unbearable. But it was present and growing, and the horses were in a full panic. She could hear them slamming against their stall doors. Could hear the high, awful sound of horses, who know they are in danger and cannot find the way out. She went straight down the center, unlatching stall doors, one after another, talking low and steady, the way she'd heard Rowan do it, the same low, even tone. Not words exactly, just sound. Just the sound of something human and calm in the middle of chaos. The first horse, Rowan's gray mare, came out of her stall and moved hard toward the back of the barn, and Eliza had to put her body sideways in the aisle to turn her. No, she said low and firm. This way, come on. The mare hesitated, nostrils, enormous eyes white-rimmed, and then some animal decision happened, and she moved forward toward the main doors. The second horse followed. The third. Eliza was at the main doors now, and she hauled the left one open, and the horses hit the night air, and Pete was there. She could hear him at the gate, hear him pushing it wide, hear his voice doing the same low, steadying work as hers, and the horses went through. She turned back for the fourth horse, Rowan's dun gelding, who was still in the far stall, and that was when the east corner came fully apart. It wasn't an explosion. It was more like the fire deciding it was done being patient. The east wall lit top to bottom in about 4 seconds, and the heat came across the interior like a physical force, like something shoving her. And the dun gelding screamed a horse sound she never wanted to hear again, and she had his stall door open and her hand on his halter, and she was moving backward toward the main doors, saying his name, which she wasn't sure she'd ever known before, but it came out of her anyway. Easy, easy, come on, that's right, come on. And they came through the main doors together into the cold air, and the gelding tore away from her and went through the gate, and she stumbled and caught herself on the fence post and stood there breathing. The east wall of the barn was fully engaged. The rest would follow in minutes. She turned and ran back toward the house and collided in the dark between the barn and the house directly with a man she'd never seen before. He caught her by both arms, and she felt the size of him much larger than her smelling of horse and cold air, and something chemical she couldn't name, and his grip was not gentle. Well now, he said. She didn't scream. She didn't try to pull away. She looked at him with absolute steadiness and said, "You're going to want to let go of me." He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that was not actually about humor. Garrett said there was a woman here, didn't say she was. The sound of a rifle cocking behind him stopped whatever he'd been about to say. Rowan Hale said, "Let her go." His voice in that moment was something Eliza had not heard from him before. It wasn't loud. It wasn't what she would have called angry. It was below anger, below whatever emotion anger came from. It was the voice of someone who had arrived at a place past decisions and was simply stating fact. The man holding her arms went very still. "Last time," Rowan said. The hands released. She stepped back and to the side out of the line between the two men, because she was not foolish enough to stand in it. The man who'd grabbed her turned slowly, hands going out from his body, in the universal language of, "I am reconsidering my choices," and in the firelight from the burning barn, she got her first clear look at Rowan's face. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. His coat was torn at the shoulder. He'd been in a fight on the North Range, and he had come back from it, and the look on his face, as his eyes moved from the man in front of him, to Eliza, and then back again, was a look she would remember for the rest of her life. Not rage exactly. Something older than rage. Something that had been sitting behind all that careful quietness for a long time, and had finally decided it was done sitting. "The horses are out," she said, because he needed to know it, and because she needed something to say that wasn't about the way he was looking at her. Pete got them through the east gate, all four. Something moved through Rowan's expression, relief she thought complicated by everything else going on in it. "You went in there," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't quite a question either. "The hay stores are gone," she said. "But the horses are out." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the man in front of him, who was taking very careful note of the rifle, and doing nothing aggressive with his hands. "Start walking," Rowan said. "Back the way you came. If I see you on this property again, I will not be as patient as I am being right now." The man walked. Rowan watched until he was beyond the north fence, and then he lowered the rifle and turned fully to Eliza, and she could see now that the cut above his eye was worse than she'd first thought, long and deep running from his eyebrow toward his temple, and without entirely deciding to, she closed the distance between them and put her hand up to his face to look at it, and he went absolutely still under her hand. "You need this cleaned," she said. "I'm all right." "Rowan, you need this cleaned." He let out a breath. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Pete came around from the direction of the east gate, moving fast, and pulled up short when he saw them. His eyes went from Rowan's face to Eliza, to the rifle, to the burning east wall of the barn, and he processed all of it in about 2 seconds, the way Pete processed most things. "How many?" he said to Rowan. "3 on the North Range, 2 here that I saw. Cutter was running them, he's gone. I don't know which direction." Rowan's voice had come back to something closer to its usual register, still tight, but no longer that other thing. "They took maybe 40 head from the east pasture before we got back." Pete's mouth set in a hard line. 40 head. "Maybe 40. I'll know better in the morning." Rowan looked at the barn. The east wall was gone now, opening to the sky, the fire having consumed what it wanted there, and beginning to look for more. "We need to get water on the west wall or we lose the whole structure." "I'll start the pump," Pete said, already moving. They spent the next 2 hours saving what was left of the barn. It was brutal work, cold air heat from the burning section, the pump and the buckets, and Rowan and Pete moving in the rhythm of men who knew hard work well enough to stop thinking and just do it. Eliza worked beside them. She didn't ask whether she should. She just took up a position in the line and worked her arms, burning her lungs full of smoke-tinged air, focused on the single task of keeping the water moving. By the time the fire was down to controllable embers in the ruined east section and the rest of the barn structure stood damaged, but standing, she could barely lift her arms. Rowan looked at her across the yard in the gray pre-dawn light, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There were no good words for what the night had been. There was just what was left of the barn and the cold and the sound of their own exhausted breathing. Then Pete said from somewhere behind them, "I'll stay with it." Inside, she cleaned the cut above Rowan's eye with water heated on the stove, and the strip of clean linen she tore from the bottom of her oldest petticoat, because there was nothing else suitable, and Rowan sat on the chair at the table and let her do it, which in itself told her how tired he was, because he was not a man who let anyone do things for him easily. "Cutter had 3 men waiting on the north fence," he said while she worked. "They hit the cattle first, started moving them before I realized what I was hearing. By the time I got back..." He stopped. "You got back," she said. "I shouldn't have been that far out. You couldn't have known they'd split the approach." She pressed the cloth gently against the cut, and he didn't flinch. "This is what Garrett does, Rowan. He's been doing it to people for years. You couldn't have anticipated every piece of it. I should have had you somewhere safer." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly. He was right at eye level with her because she was standing, and he was sitting. And this close, she could see the exhaustion in his face and the guilt in it. And underneath both of those things, something she didn't look at for long, because it undid something in her that she needed to keep together right now. "I got 4 horses out of a burning barn," she said quietly. "I'm not someone who needs to be somewhere safer. I'm someone who needs to be useful, and I was. You need to understand the difference." He looked at her. His jaw worked once. "I understand it," he said. He stopped again. She had noticed over these weeks that Rowan Hale had no trouble being articulate about practical things. It was the other things that stopped him, the ones that mattered more. "I know," she said. She didn't make him finish it. She went back to cleaning the cut. After a while, he said, "The documentation." "Against my ribs all night," she said. "It's fine." A sound came out of him that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one surprised and low and briefly real in a way that changed his face entirely. She'd heard that sound from him twice before, and both times it had done something unexpected to the space behind her sternum. She finished with the cut and stepped back. He caught her hand before she could fully step away. Not grabbing the same as before that night over the ledger, just stopping. His hand around hers, and his eyes finding hers, and the question in them that he wasn't going to say out loud, because that was not how he was built. She turned her hand in his, so that her fingers were over his knuckles, answering him without words, because she understood his language by now. They stayed like that for a moment that was longer than a moment. Then from outside, Pete's voice called something about the west wall, and they both let go at the same time, and Rowan stood and went to the door, and Eliza stood at the table for a second, looking at the oilcloth packet she'd set on the surface when she came in. 47 pages dry and whole, every word intact. Garrett had sent men with fire and muscle, and the specific, calculated cruelty of someone who believed that enough force applied to the right places could collapse a person's will along with their barn. He'd taken 40 cattle. He'd destroyed the east wall. He'd split Rowan off from his property in the dark and sent a man who was twice Eliza's size to put his hands on her. And he had not gotten the documentation. He had not gotten the horses. He had not gotten Rowan Hale's willingness to stand his ground. He had not gotten Eliza Cross. She buttoned her coat, tucked the packet back inside against her body, and walked out to help Pete with the wall. The sun came up gray and thin over the Beartooth Range the way it did in late winter when the season hadn't yet decided to release its hold. The barn stood. The horses were safe in the near pasture. The counter record was intact, and somewhere between the burning barn and the cold gray dawn, the thing that had been taking shape between Rowan Hale and Eliza Cross for 7 weeks had stopped being something nameless and become something that both of them knew, even if neither of them had said it yet. Garrett was not finished. They both knew that too, but then neither were they. The cattle they recovered numbered 31. Rowan and Pete rode the East Range for the better part of 2 days after the fire, and 31 was the final count, 9 head gone driven north toward Garrett's land in the dark, and absorbed into a herd large enough that proving which animals had come from where would require exactly the kind of documentation that Garrett's lawyers would spend months disputing. Rowan came in on the second evening and sat down at the table and said the number quietly the way you say a number when you've already done the grieving for it, and what's left is just the fact. Eliza set coffee in front of him and sat across from him and said, 31 is enough to rebuild from. It's enough if nothing else goes wrong. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The hay stores are half what they were. West wall of the barn's holding, but it'll need proper repair before the next hard freeze. What does proper repair cost? He told her. She did the calculation in her head, and then she told him what his remaining accounts could sustain and what they couldn't, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him, the completeness of his attention when something mattered. So we're tight, he said when she finished. We're tight, she agreed. But we're not broken. There's a difference. He looked at her across the table. The cut above his eye had scabbed cleanly and would scar, she thought, a thin line running from his brow toward his temple that would be there long after all of this was over. You keep finding the difference, he said, between what's bad and what's finished. Someone has to. It ain't just someone doing it, he said. It's you. She didn't answer that. She got up and refilled his coffee, and he let her change the subject, and they talked about the barn repair for another hour with the practicality of two people who had learned that the best way to hold something difficult was to keep moving around it while the real thing settled. The notice from the county land office arrived 9 days after the filing. Aldridge had written it himself, which Pete said was unusual. Typically, notices came from the territorial clerk's office in a standardized form. The fact that Aldridge had written this one in his own hand and sent it by private courier rather than the regular mail run was information in itself, and Eliza read it 3 times before she said anything. The inquiry panel was scheduled. 32 days from the date of filing. Standard timeline, standard location. The Callaway Municipal Building, which was also the standard location for territorial land hearings. All of that was expected. What was not expected was the final paragraph which Aldridge had written in a slightly different hand, smaller, as though he'd added it after the main body and hadn't wanted it to look like part of the official document. It said, "The opposing party has retained legal representation from Helena. You are advised to prepare accordingly." She handed the letter to Rowan. He read it. His face did not change, which meant it had changed in the small ways she'd learned to read, the slight tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible set of his jaw. "Helena," he said. "Garrett has money," she said. "We knew he'd bring someone." "We don't have money for Helena lawyers." "No," she said. "But we have 47 pages that a Helena lawyer can't argue with because the math doesn't care who's arguing it." She kept her voice steady. "The documentation is the case, Rowan. A lawyer from Helena can dress it up in language and procedure, but he cannot change what the numbers say. The entries were falsified. I can prove it line by line. That doesn't stop being true because Garrett hired someone expensive." Rowan set the letter down. "You'd have to speak to it," he said. "In the hearing. They'll ask who prepared the counter record." "I know. They'll try to discredit you." "I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. "Coldwater Ridge," he said quietly, not as an accusation, as a thing he was holding up to the light to see whether it had weight. "They'll find out," she said. "If Garrett's man in Helena is worth what Garrett's paying him, he'll find out about Daniel Marsh and the letters and all of it." She said it plainly because there was no other useful way to say it. "And he'll bring it into the hearing to establish that my character is questionable, and therefore my documentation is questionable." Is that legal? In a territorial land hearing, character testimony is admissible as it pertains to the credibility of evidence preparers. She'd spent 2 evenings with the territorial code that Aldridge had included with the filing confirmation. She knew exactly what Garrett's lawyer was going to try. It's legal. It's also the only angle they have because the numbers themselves are clean. Rowan stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She let him have the moment. She'd learned the shape of Rowan Hale's silences. Which ones were thinking? Which ones were feeling? Which ones were something he needed to work through on his own? This one was the last kind. When he turned around, His face had resolved into something. "Then we prepare for that too," he said. "We don't walk in there hoping they won't use it. We walk in there ready for when they do." "That's what I was going to say." "I know it is." Something in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same territory. What do we do? What they did over the next 3 weeks was build the case inside the case. The numbers were already documented. What needed building now was the human architecture around them. The sequence of witnesses, the order of evidence, the anticipation of every objection a Helena lawyer might raise, and the answer ready before the objection finished landing. Eliza worked from the territorial code and from the 3 years of watching Alderman Cross navigate disputes with suppliers and county officials, and Rowan contributed the specific knowledge of his own land and operations that no outside lawyer could have, and that would prove in accumulated detail that the discrepancies in his accounts could only have been introduced from outside. Pete agreed to testify about the assessor's visit without being asked twice. He sat at the table one evening, and Eliza walked him through what the hearing would look like, what questions he'd be asked how to answer in a way that was simple and specific and left no room for interpretation. "Just tell exactly what you saw," she said. "Not what you thought about what you saw. Not what it meant to you. What you saw." Pete nodded. "The deputy took me around the south pasture. Said he wanted to check the fence line condition. Spent about an hour out there. The assessor was in the house alone the whole time." "And did the deputy ask you questions during that hour?" "Kept asking about the East Range, how far it ran, how many head we kept out there, what the water access was like." Pete's eyes sharpened. "I thought he was doing a standard assessment. Now I think he was keeping me busy." "That's what you think," she said. "At the hearing you tell them what he asked you and what you answered. The panel will think what you think." Pete looked at her with that same expression he'd had when she'd first walked him through the annotated ledger 6 weeks ago, the one that was entirely straightforwardly respect. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a land hearing," she said. "But I've sat across a table from men who were trying to make something true look like something else. It's the same skill either way." On the 17th day before the hearing, Garrett came himself. She was in the house when she heard the horses multiple, which was unusual. Rowan was at the south fence. Pete was in the barn. She went to the window and counted 4 riders at the gate, and the man at the front was dressed in the particular way of someone who owned enough not to dress for work anymore. Good coat, good horse. The kind of grooming that said he'd planned this visit rather than arrived from a day's labor. She knew it was Garrett before Rowan coming around from the south confirmed it with the way his body changed when he saw who it was. She felt it from 30 yards away, through the window glass, the particular quality of stillness that came over him. The gathering of everything he was into, the controlled surface he showed the world when the world was threatening him. She went to the door and opened it and stood on the porch. Garrett looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who considered looking at things he owned or intended to own a reasonable thing to do. He was older than she'd expected, late 50s, heavy-set through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder and more self-satisfied over the years. He had the eyes of someone who had won most of his arguments for most of his life and had lost the ability to imagine losing. "Miss," he said. "Mr. Garrett," she said. He looked at her a moment longer, recalculating something. He hadn't expected her to know his name, she could see that. He hadn't expected her to be standing in the doorway rather than retreating from it. Rowan came up to the gate. "You're not welcome here," he said. His voice was the flat, factual voice she'd heard him use on Daniel Marsh. "State your business from there." Garrett didn't move from his horse, which told her he'd thought about this. He knew better than to come onto the property. He'd come to see and be seen, not to provoke anything that could be documented against him. The men behind him stayed back and stayed still, which also told her they'd been instructed. This was theater. Careful, calculated theater. "I came to make you an offer, Hale," Garrett said. His voice was the voice of a man who'd spent decades making offers that weren't really offers. "The hearing in Callaway is going to be unpleasant for everyone. I'm willing to spare us both that unpleasantness." "Go on," Rowan said. He crossed his arms. $1,500 for the property. Fair value by any measure. You take that and move on, and we close the file at the land office, and nobody has to sit in a room for 3 days listening to lawyers argue." Rowan said nothing. "It's a good offer," Garrett said. There was something underneath the reasonableness, now something that had been there all along, but was getting less patient about being covered. "Better than what you'll walk away with if the hearing doesn't go your way." "The hearing's going to go our way," Rowan said. Garrett looked at him steadily. Then he looked at Eliza, a long, deliberate look, the kind designed to communicate that he knew things about her that he could choose to use. "I've made some inquiries," he said, "about your arrangement here." Eliza felt herself go very still inside. She'd been waiting for this. She'd known this moment was coming since the day Aldridge's letter arrived. She looked back at Garrett with the same flat steadiness she'd used on Daniel Marsh in front of the feed store. The steadiness that she'd had to build brick by brick over 9 days of being the person Coldwater Ridge had decided she was, and that she'd decided in Rowan's back room by lantern light, she was not going to let anyone use against her ever again. "If you have something to say," she said, "you can say it to the panel in Callaway." Garrett's expression shifted. Something moved across it that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of woman standing in that doorway. "The offer stands for 48 hours, he said to Rowan. He didn't look at Eliza again. "Think carefully." He turned his horse and rode out with his men behind him, and the sound of them faded back toward the north, and the yard was quiet again. Rowan came through the gate and walked up to the porch and stood one step below her, which put them eye to eye. "1,500, he said. "It's what the land is worth if you strip out 10 years of your work on it," she said. "He knows what it's actually worth." "He does." Rowan's eyes were still on the road where Garrett had gone. "He's not going to stop at this offer." "No, he's going to try the character testimony at the hearing, and he's going to try it hard." She said it carefully. "Rowan, I want you to know that whatever he brings into that room about me, I can hold it. I need you to know that. I'm not going to come apart in front of a panel because a lawyer from Helena says my name in an unpleasant tone." Rowan looked at her. He looked at her for a long time the way he sometimes did when he was seeing something he was still learning the edges of. "I know you can hold it," he said. "Then you don't have to worry about my part of this." "I know I don't have to." He paused. "That doesn't mean I won't." The 48 hours came and went. They sent no reply to Garrett's offer because there was no reply to send. On the morning the deadline passed, Pete came in for breakfast, and the three of them sat at the table and ate in the companionable quiet of people who had made their decision and were living inside it now, on the other side of all the deliberation. That evening, Rowan asked her to walk with him. He didn't say where. She put on her coat and went. They walked the south fence line in the last of the daylight, not talking much, just walking the land that he'd built his life around, and that she had spent 2 months fighting to keep for him, and she understood why he'd asked her, without either of them needing to say it out loud. He wanted her to know this land the way he knew it. He wanted her to have walked it. At the south corner, where the fence post lantern burned, the one that had been dark for 2 weeks, the one she'd claimed to have followed in the dark on the first night, which had never entirely been true, and which he'd never pressed her on, he stopped and turned to face her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right, after the hearing." He stopped. He tried again. "When this is settled one way or another, I want to know what you—" He stopped again. She watched him work through it, the same way she'd watched him work through difficult things all these weeks, with the patience you gave something that deserved to be gotten right. "I want to know if you'd consider staying," he said finally. "Not because of the work, not because I need the accounts kept, because—" He looked at her with everything he usually kept behind the carefulness fully visible. "Because this place isn't the same as what it was before you came to it, and I don't want it to go back." The lantern at the fence post moved slightly in the wind. The last light was going pink and gray over the mountains. She looked at Rowan Hale's honest, scarred, careful face, and thought about the rain and the dark and the long walk and the door that had opened, and everything that had come after it. "I considered it," she said, "about 3 weeks in." Something moved through his expression, quick and unguarded and real. And I'm still here," she said. He let out a breath. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 2 months of watching him. He smiled. A full, undefended smile, the kind that reached his eyes, the kind that cost him nothing, because it was entirely meant. It changed his face into something she hadn't seen from him before, and would spend a long time being glad she'd seen it all. He reached out and took her hand, and they walked back toward the house together through the cold, settling evening, and neither of them said anything else because everything that needed saying had been said. The hearing was in 11 days, and for the first time since she'd walked through that door in the rain, Eliza Cross was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready for it. She was standing on solid ground. She had 47 pages of irrefutable truth in an oilcloth packet, and a man beside her who had earned the right to stand there, and she was ready. The morning of the hearing, Eliza was up before the sun. She dressed carefully. Not for vanity, she had no interest in vanity, but with the deliberateness of someone who understood that how a woman presented herself in a room full of men who had already decided what she was worth would be part of the argument before she opened her mouth. She wore the best dress she had, the dark brown wool she'd mended twice since arriving, pinned at the collar, with the small silver brooch that had been her mother's. She pinned her hair up clean and straight. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the back room wall and said quietly, and to no one in particular, "You've done harder things than this." Then she picked up the oilcloth packet from the table where she'd set it the night before and went out to meet Rowan and Pete at the wagon. Rowan looked at her when she came out. He didn't say anything about how she looked, which was somehow more than if he had the way. His eyes moved over her once, with something steady and sure in them. The way he offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat without making it into a gesture. She took his hand and climbed up, and he went around to the other side, and they drove toward Callaway in the early gray cold, with Pete in the back and the packet on her lap under her hands, and the mountains showing their first pale light far to the west. The Callaway Municipal Building held more people than Eliza had expected. Word had traveled. It always did in this country where distance made news precious, and anything involving Garrett's land ambitions was of practical interest to every rancher within 40 miles. The room was full when they arrived, benches packed on both sides, and the noise of it dropped by several degrees when Eliza walked in with Rowan and Pete behind her. Not because they knew her, but because they knew the shape of what was happening, and could see from the way the three of them moved that this was not going to be the routine default proceeding Garrett had been planning on. The panel was 3 men, a territorial judge named Kavanaugh, a county land commissioner Eliza had found referenced in the territorial code, and a third she didn't recognize who turned out to be a representative from the governor's office, which Aldridge had apparently requested in view of the significance of the documentation. That third man was the one Eliza watched most carefully as they took their seats, because he was the one who hadn't been here long enough to have been influenced by Garrett's money or Garrett's connections. Garrett's lawyer was already at the opposing table. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the pressed, polished look of someone who had done well in Helena and knew it. He had a leather case on the table, and an expression of relaxed confidence that was designed to communicate that this was already settled business, and the proceedings were a formality. He looked at Eliza, once assessed her with the quick efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and looked away. She noted it. She filed it. Garrett himself sat in the front bench behind his lawyer, dressed in the same good coat he'd worn to the property, with 2 men on either side of him, who were clearly not there for legal purposes. He didn't look at Rowan. He looked at Eliza, a long, deliberate look that was meant to feel like pressure. She met it and held it until he looked away first. Kavanaugh called the hearing to order, and the room went quiet. And Garrett's lawyer Eliza learned his name was Philip Stroud, of the Helena firm Stroud. And Merritt stood and presented the case for default in the smooth, organized language of someone who had prepared carefully and knew his material. The falsified entries were framed as recording errors on Rowan's part. The debt figure they generated was presented as accurate and properly assessed. The timeline of the default proceeding was laid out correctly, and in the right order, because Stroud was too good to make procedural mistakes. He spoke for 22 minutes. The room listened. Then Eliza was called to present the counter record. She walked to the table at the front of the room with the oilcloth packet in her hands, and she set it down and unwrapped it with the same deliberateness she had brought to every part of this from the beginning, and she placed the 47 pages in front of the panel in the order she'd arranged them, and she began. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared the truth in a form that could not be argued with, and she walked the panel through it the way she had walked Rowan through it the first time. Line by line, entry by entry, each fabricated figure set against the corresponding legitimate receipt, with the date and the amount and the source, all clearly annotated and cross-referenced. She spoke in plain language. She defined the technical terms she used as she used them. She did not rush, and she did not apologize, and she did not look at Stroud when he shifted in his chair, or at Garrett when she heard him say something low and sharp to the man beside him. After 35 minutes, Kavanaugh held up a hand and said, "Miss Cross, these 4 entries you've marked. You're asserting they were introduced externally, not by the property owner." "Yes, sir," she said. "On what basis?" "3 bases," she said. She turned to the annotated page. "First, there are no corresponding receipts for these transactions in Mr. Hale's records, while every other entry in 3 years of accounts has a corresponding receipt." She pointed. "Second, the handwriting in these 4 entries differs from Mr. Hale's hand in specific ways I've documented on the facing page. The angle of the numerals, the way the dollar sign is formed, 2-letter formations that don't match any other entry in the ledger. Third, one of these entries is dated on a Sunday. Mr. Hale has no transactions recorded on Sundays in 3 years of accounts, and when I asked him about it, he told me that he has never conducted business on Sundays as a matter of practice." She looked at the panel steadily. Someone who knew his accounts was fabricated these entries carefully. They simply didn't know him well enough to know about Sundays. The room had gone very still. The governor's representative leaned forward. "And you prepared this documentation yourself, Miss Cross?" "I did." "What is your relevant experience?" She told him. 3 years with Alderman Cross the freight operation. Before that, the discrepancy she'd found that had saved $400. She told it plainly and factually, and when she was done, the governor's representative sat back with an expression that was not quite the relaxed confidence of Stroud's table, but was something considerably more substantial. Stroud stood for cross-examination. He was good. She had known he would be. He started with the methodology, asking precise technical questions about the cross-referencing process, trying to find a gap in the documentation that he could widen into reasonable doubt. He didn't find one, because there were no gaps, because she had spent 3 weeks building something without gaps, and she knew where every seam was. Then he moved to character. "Miss Cross," he said with the particular gentleness that was not gentleness at all, "you were employed as a bookkeeper in Coldwater Ridge. Is that correct?" "It is." "And you left that employment?" "I did." "Under what circumstances did you leave Coldwater Ridge?" The room was quiet in a particular way now. She could feel Rowan behind her and to the left, very still, and Pete beside him, and the weight of 40 people watching her, and the quality of Garrett's attention from the front bench, satisfied, anticipatory. She had thought about this moment for 11 days. She had turned it over from every angle. She had prepared an answer that was defensive, and then discarded it, because defensive answers created the impression of something to defend. She had prepared an answer that was aggressive, and discarded that too, because it would read as instability. In the end, she had come back to the only thing that had ever actually worked for her, the thing that had worked in the barn and on the porch and across every hard moment of the last 2 months. The plain truth delivered without flinching. "I left Coldwater Ridge," she said clearly into the stillness, "because a man I had trusted read private correspondence of mine to other men without my knowledge or consent, and when the resulting gossip made my position in that town untenable, I left rather than remain somewhere. I was not welcome." She looked at Stroud directly. "If you're asking whether my character was questioned in Coldwater Ridge, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether those questions were founded on anything I actually did, the answer is no. And if you're asking whether any of that has any bearing on whether 2 plus 2 equals 4, the answer is absolutely not. Someone in the room made a sound. More than one someone. Stroud kept his expression composed with what she could see was genuine effort. Nevertheless, the circumstances of your departure suggest, Mr. Stroud, Kavanaugh said without inflection. Is there a question? Stroud recalibrated. He tried 2 more angles, both clean and professional, and neither of them finding purchase because the documentation didn't depend on her reputation, it depended on arithmetic. And arithmetic did not care what Daniel Marsh had read aloud in a Coldwater Ridge saloon. After a third attempt that landed on equally solid ground, Stroud sat down with the careful composure of a man who was rearranging his expectations. Pete testified next. He told the panel exactly what he'd seen during the assessor's visit in the plain specific language Eliza had coached him toward what the deputy had asked. What he'd answered, how long they'd been outside, that the assessor had been alone in the house for the duration. He answered Stroud's cross-examination with the same economy of language and left the stand having given the panel exactly what they needed to see and nothing more. The hearing recessed for 2 hours. Eliza sat on the bench outside the main room with Rowan beside her and Pete across from them, and none of them spoke much. There was nothing useful left to say. The case had been made. The documentation was in Kavanaugh's hands. Whatever happened in that room now was going to happen, and there was no further argument she could construct to influence it. Rowan put his hand over hers on the bench. She turned her hand and let her fingers settle between his, the way they had at the south fence, and they sat like that in the quiet of the hallway, while the building moved around them and the clock on the wall above the door moved through its slow accounting of the 2 hours. When Kavanaugh called them back in, Garrett was already at his bench. He had not left the building during the recess. He sat with his lawyer and his 2 men, and the settled expression of someone who had decided that what was about to happen was going to be what he expected. And when Eliza came back in and walked to the front of the room, she felt his eyes on her back, like a hand pressing, and she straightened her spine against it and did not turn around. Kavanaugh looked at the papers before him for a long moment. The room was so quiet that the sound of someone's boot shifting on the floor came through clearly. In the matter of the territorial debt proceeding against the Hale property, Kavanaugh said, "This panel finds the counter record submitted by Miss Eliza Cross to be compelling, thorough, and materially sufficient." He looked over the papers at the room. The 4 entries in contest are not consistent with the property owner's established recording practices and the absence of corresponding receipts in a ledger where every other entry across 3 years has a corresponding receipt creates a preponderance of evidence for external interference. He set the papers down. The default proceeding is dismissed. The land record stands in favor of Rowan Hale. The panel further refers the matter of the falsified entries to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation. The room broke apart. Not loudly. This was not a loud room, but in the way rooms break when something significant has just been decided. A sudden release of held breath across 40 people, a collective shifting voices beginning where there had been silence. Eliza sat very still. She heard Garrett's chair move. She heard his lawyer's voice, low and controlled, saying something about appeal procedures. She heard Pete exhale behind her in a long, slow breath that had probably been held for 2 hours. She heard all of it from a slight remove, the way you sometimes hear things when the thing you've been braced for finally stops happening. Then Rowan said her name very quietly just once, and she looked at him. His face was open in the same way it had been at the south fence on the last evening, unguarded, real, the carefulness set aside. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He brought her hand up, the one he was still holding, and pressed it briefly firmly, and then he stood and turned to Pete, who clapped him once on the shoulder, with a hand that said everything. Pete Delaney never said in words, and then he turned back to her and held out his other hand to help her up from the bench, and she took it and stood. Garrett left without looking at either of them. His lawyer followed, and the 2 men behind him, and she watched them go with the particular feeling of someone watching a weather system move off. Not triumph exactly. Nothing as easy as triumph, but the solid recognition that the storm had passed and the ground was still there. Aldridge was waiting near the door. He looked at Eliza when she came through and said without preamble in a voice that was entirely personal rather than official, "Finest piece of land dispute documentation I've seen in 16 years, ma'am, bar none." "Thank you," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked out into the cold. The drive back to the ranch was quieter than the drive in, and also entirely different in the way that the same silence can mean completely different things depending on what's sitting inside it. This silence was the kind that comes after something has been finished and found to be finished correctly. Pete fell asleep in the back of the wagon before they'd cleared Calloway's main street, which seemed to Eliza like exactly the right response. Rowan drove, and she sat beside him, and the mountains came back into view as the road opened up and the day was going toward its middle, and the cold was the ordinary winter cold that had nothing threatening in it. "The barn repair," he said after a while. 3 weeks if the weather holds," she said. "I've been pricing the lumber in my head since Thursday. We can cover it if we're careful through March." And the 9 head. "We rebuild the number by fall. It's tight, but it's manageable." She looked at the road. "I can take on some accounts work. There are ranches between here and Calloway that don't have anyone keeping their books properly. I know because I've seen the way Pete talks about their operations, and none of them sound like they have anyone watching the numbers." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You'd stay for that?" "I'd stay," she said simply, "because I told you I would." He looked at her sideways quickly, and then back at the road, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it sometimes did when he was holding something back that wanted to be larger than he was ready to let it be yet. "I'm going to want to make that official," he said, "at some point, sooner than later." Her heart did something uncomplicated and complete. "You might want to ask," she said, "before you make plans." "I'm asking now." "That's not—" She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the road with the absolute concentration of a man who was not looking at the road at all. "Rowan." "Eliza," he said in the same tone. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was the most undone she had ever heard him sound, and it lasted only a second before he recomposed himself into something that was still obviously moved, but wearing its usual outer layer, and she loved both things about it. The second of coming undone and the regathering afterward, because both of them were entirely him. Pete from the back of the wagon, without opening his eyes, said, "About time." She laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Rowan made a sound beside her that was something close to one, and Pete smiled with his eyes still closed, and the wagon rolled on through the cold Montana afternoon, toward a ranch that had a damaged barn, and a recovered herd, and a second box under the floorboards that no longer needed to hold anything except what they chose to put in it. That evening she stood at the window of the house that had stopped being a stranger's house around the 3rd week, and had become, without any single moment she could point to, simply home. The mountains to the west held the last of the light, the way they always did, this time of day, going from white to gold to something between rose and gray that had no name she knew. The horses were in the near pasture. The barn stood damaged on one side but standing. The fence line ran straight and true down to the south corner, where the lantern burned as it burned every night, casting its small, steady light into whatever dark came. She thought about the woman who had walked through that dark 11 weeks ago, wet and cold and out of road, and carrying nothing but the determination not to lie down in it. She thought about the door that had opened. She thought about what it had taken to build from that doorway, everything that now existed inside this fence line, the counter record, the testimony, the 31 head in the pasture, the 11 weeks of work and trust, and 2 people learning each other the way you learn something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. Rowan came to stand beside her at the window. He stood close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. "Tomorrow we start on the west wall," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She had walked through that door with nothing, and built with her own hands, and her own mind, and her own undefeated certainty in the worth of what she knew, a life that no one, not Daniel Marsh, not Coldwater Ridge, not Garrett and his Helena lawyers, and his men with fire, had been able to take from her. She was Eliza Cross, and she was exactly where she had decided to be, and she was never leaving again.